Hey, what's up guys? Alex here with a new video. Today we're going to be doing the comparison everyone seems to be doing because it's such an interesting one. Today we will be comparing Apple's new iPhone 14 Pro with its latest 48 megapixel sensor and my Sony A7IV with a full frame 33 megapixel sensor. This year, Apple increased their sensor size and increased their megapixels for the first time in I think over a decade, and the camera is now able to shoot 48 megapixels pro RAW files. That is insane coming out of a phone. If you're not familiar with Apple Pro RAW, I think this is the future. So every phone now has a bit of computational photography, which means when you take one picture, the phone is actually bracketing several shots. It's taking anywhere from 6 to 10 photos at multiple exposures and blending them in to create a nice high dynamic range photo. Traditionally, when you take a RAW photo from a phone, the results are pretty bad. It's a small sensor, it's noisy if you're not using anything but the lowest ISO. You don't get the best results. So RAW formats on small phones, I personally don't think is worth it. But what Apple is doing is they are actually still doing all the computational photography, which is capturing several exposures and blending it into one file, but delivering a raw file. So you have tons of dynamic range and all that goodness that you have with computational photography. If you were to grab that technology and put it on a full frame camera, it would be the ultimate camera, period. But we're not there yet. That's a quick kind of summary of what makes the iPhone Pro RAW so special, and it packs a punch. So for today's comparison, I decided since I had the new Sigma 24mm 1.4 art lens for the Sony E mount, I would compare that with the iPhone 14 Pro because the iPhone now has a 24mm main camera, or 24mm equivalent. Anyways, I'm talking too much. I'm gonna go ahead and do a slideshow. All the photos have been edited with my preset, which is available in the link in the description below. I will also include all these files for you to play with yourself. And for this slideshow, all the A files will be the same and all the B files will be the same. So let's see if you guess right. After the slideshow, we'll go ahead and do a deeper dive into the photos, but I've done enough talking. Let's roll the slideshow. Okay, so what did you guys think? I think it's very interesting. It's very obvious that on any photo from a distance, any like wide photo, any non-portrait photo, the iPhone is packing a punch. The photos look great. I was completely blown away by the quality you're getting from a freaking phone. With portraits and up-close shots, I think the camera really shows its kind of weaknesses, which is it's a small sensor. And also, when you have a small camera like you do on a phone, you can't have a great lens. I mean, it's tiny, right? So there's limitations there. And when you start getting up close, you start seeing some of those limitations. But with that said though, some of these snapshots were just almost identical. So let's dive into some photos. Let's go over some of these differences. And we just have to be happy because we have this kind of power in our pockets that we carry everywhere. Let's dive right in. Okay, so here on the left we have the iPhone photo and on the right we have the Sony, and you're gonna see that the iPhone is shooting more of a square format and the full frame is a little bit wider. That's just a format thing, and this is the format you're gonna get if you shoot Pro RAW. The iPhone here is 48 megapixels, so I mean, first of all, before we even zoom in, just looking at these two photos from a distance, they look almost identical. You have a little bit more dynamic range here on the Sony file on the tree, but like, unless you're zooming in, these photos almost look the same. Zooming in though, here's where it gets interesting because the iPhone is 48 megapixels and the Sony's 33 megapixels. So by looking just at that number, the iPhone has more resolution, but does that mean more detail? Let's take a look. So if I were to zoom in here on this sign, you're gonna see even though the iPhone has more resolution, the text is cleaner and clearer on the Sony. Well, obviously, right? The Sony, you have a lens that's bigger than the phone itself, a bigger sensor. Of course, you're going to get more clarity. So just because you have 48 megapixels doesn't mean you're going to have all the detail in the world. You're still limited by the size of the sensor and the size of the optics. This is still pretty incredible for a phone, and you can't dismiss it. So I can't say anything bad about the iPhone here. Shots like this make it very, very hard to tell the difference unless you're zooming in, and shots like this is where the iPhone will shine. Let's go ahead and look at another image. So here I have the iPhone on the right and the Sony on the left, and I've tried to match the crops. Again, this is another image where it's just a quick snapshot, not a portrait, because I want to make it a little close before we kind of start seeing some differences. And again, for a portrait like this, you're going to see that the iPhone has incredible dynamic range. Looking at it just from a distance, they look almost identical. Zooming in, you'll see that, let's let the iPhone kind of load here. You'll see that, of course, the Sony has more detail, even though there's less megapixels. And of course, there's more fringing. And again, limitations of a small lens on the iPhone, but from a distance, this is very impressive. Let's take a look at a portrait. So here we have a wide angle portrait of my wife. On the right-hand side, we have the iPhone. On the left-hand side, we have the Sony. And taking a look here, the dead giveaway is a depth of field. You can see here, obviously shooting at a 24-1.4 on the Sony, you do have some blur in the background. And on the iPhone, everything is just sharp. But if you were to stop down the Sony, you could probably get a similar result. Again, even though in this photo, I think it's pretty obvious which camera is which, it's still pretty impressive to see what the iPhone is doing. Now, zooming in, you're gonna see that in this photo, the iPhone actually holds up extremely well. Both images here have detail. Both are somewhat sharp. This Sigma 24 isn't the sharpest wide open. I mean, this is very impressive on the iPhone. I bet you if we shot this in portrait mode, it would probably look closer, but the problem is if you shoot portrait mode, you're going to 12 megapixels and you're not getting the 48 megapixel RAW file. And of course, you can see here the depth of field is just night and day. Let's take a look at another image. Again, another portrait of my wife. The depth of field gives it away. Everything here is in focus on the iPhone. On the Sony, you have that natural blur. But this iPhone picture, if I didn't have the Sony on me and this is the only camera I had, I just took a quick snapshot of my wife, I would be totally happy with this. You can see that you still get great colors, great skin tones, great detail. Very, very impressive. Let's just zoom in to see how it holds up. This is actually kind of wild. The iPhone's holding up pretty well against the Sony. Now the Sony's still winning, full frame sensor, again, better optics. But from a detail perspective, the fact that we're getting this here on the right-hand side from a phone, gotta give it to Apple. That's pretty good. Now let's take a look at an image where the iPhone just completely falls apart. So here is a very high dynamic range situation. This photo I actually underexposed because I needed to capture the detail in the sky and not blow it out. And then I knew I was gonna bring up the shadows in post. As mentioned, the iPhone does computational photography. It takes tons of photos and it combines them. Even though it's a RAW file, you're still getting some of that magic. Now, that's good for, I think, a traditional photo because you have added dynamic range. With portraits like this, it actually makes the file worse because the iPhone tried to save the detail in my wife, the skin tones, and capture information there because it knows it's in the shadows. It doesn't know I'm gonna try to recover it after, and it just kind of created this weird HDR looking image, and there's a haze to my wife. It just does not look good, where in the Sony here, it just looks, I think, incredible. Let's go ahead and zoom in so you can kind of see a little bit more what I'm talking about. Zooming in here, you can see what the iPhone did. Like the skin tones look wonky. There's like a purple hue. It almost looks like skin smoothing was applied here, and I did not apply anything. This is just all straight from the phone. So the iPhone definitely tried to compensate for her being in the shadows, recognizing a face, and just totally ruined this shot. If there was no computational photography here, I think it might have done a little bit better, but it gets tough then because you're lifting up the shadows and you have a small sensor. So anyways, let's go ahead and wrap up this video. Actually, I have one more sample I want to cover, and then we'll get to our final thoughts. So here I have another set of photos. On the left, obviously Sony. On the right, the iPhone. Here you can truly see the depth of field differences. And I took this photo because I also wanted to take a portrait mode photo, because I know it's gonna come up a lot. Well, how does it look in portrait mode? I didn't really use portrait mode in this comparison because, again, you're not getting a RAW file, you're not getting the 48 megapixels, you're getting a JPEG file, so I didn't use it. But I wanted to include a photo so you can see some of the issues you'd get with portrait mode and why it's still not a reliable option. On the right-hand side, I now have the iPhone portrait mode photo of this cup, and you can already probably see it. If I zoom in here on the straw, I don't know what portrait mode is doing, but we have these jagged edges all over the place, and it just looks extremely wonky. It does a good job with the background and the sky and kind of replicating bokeh, but it still struggles with objects and hair, and it's just not reliable. So you might get some great results from time to time, but they're not consistent results. And that's why, as great as portrait mode is, I can't consider it an alternative to a real camera. With that said, let's go ahead and go into my final thoughts. It's safe to say Apple's done a tremendous job with a new iPhone 14 Pro, and the computational photography, Pro RAW, larger sensor, everything they're doing is truly game changing. And I think for the first time ever, there is no reason to carry any camera other than an iPhone or an APS-C camera and above. I just don't see why you would carry a point and shoot, even maybe a 1-inch sensor camera. With the iPhone's quality being this good and being on your phone, I think to really start seeing a massive difference and really kind of justifying the cost of a camera, you have to go minimum APS-C. This is changing. It's changing I think the landscape. I've had people message me on Instagram telling me that photographers will die in 5 to 10 years. That's not gonna happen. You're still gonna need a camera. And I think as this computational photography evolves and goes into full frame cameras, APS-C size cameras, that will be the next evolution, and that will create another level of separation between an iPhone and a real camera. If Sony, Canon, Nikon, Fuji, Leica, if they don't adapt and start incorporating computational photography, they might be in trouble as these sensors get larger and that gap starts getting smaller. So guys, what did you think? As always, let me know down in the comments below. Please like this video, please subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Have a good one, guys. Peace.